History often remembers the generals who ordered the charges, the politicians who declared the wars, and the pilots who dropped the bombs. But it frequently forgets the architects of survival, the men and women who fought a quieter yet infinitely more complex battle against death itself. In the early 1940s, as the shadow of the Third Reich lengthened across Europe and the Blitz turned London into a landscape of fire and rubble, the Allied forces faced a crisis that threatened to undermine their entire war effort. Soldiers weren't just dying from bullets or shrapnel, they were dying from shock. On the battlefields of France and in the bombed-out streets of Britain, life was slipping away simply because there was no way to replace the blood pouring out of the wounded. The medical logistics were a nightmare. Whole blood was fragile, it spoiled quickly, and transporting it across the Atlantic seemed like a biological impossibility. The world needed a miracle. It needed a system that didn't exist. Enter Dr. Charles Drew. To the casual observer of history, he might appear as just another name on a list of medical professionals, but to the thousands of soldiers bleeding out on the front lines, he was the difference between a telegram home and a future. Drew was not merely a doctor, he was a visionary of preservation. While others saw blood as a perishable fluid, Drew saw it as a resource that could be banked, managed, and deployed like ammunition. His doctoral thesis, Banked Blood, a study on blood preservation, wasn't just an academic exercise, it was the blueprint for modern salvation. He understood that by separating plasma, the liquid component of blood, from the cells, it could be stored for longer periods and transfused to anyone, regardless of blood type. This was the golden fluid that would turn the tide of medical history. When Great Britain issued a desperate plea for blood, it was Charles Drew who answered. He was appointed the medical director of the Blood for Britain project, a massive undertaking that required the precision of a military operation and the delicacy of a laboratory experiment. In New York hospitals, under his strict supervision, the collection began. But Drew didn't just oversee the science, he revolutionized the logistics. He established rigorous standards for collection, processing, and safety that were light years ahead of his time. He demanded uniformity when chaos was the norm. Under his watch, thousands of liters of life-saving plasma were processed, packed, and shipped across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean to the veins of British civilians and soldiers. But his genius didn't stop at the laboratory door. Drew realized that in war, the hospital couldn't always wait for the patient. Sometimes, the hospital had to go to the donor. He engineered the concept of the bloodmobile, refrigerated trucks equipped to collect and store blood on the go. It was a masterstroke of accessibility, democratizing the act of saving lives. Suddenly, the factory worker, the housewife, and the shopkeeper could contribute directly to the war effort from their own neighborhoods. He transformed blood donation from a rare medical procedure into a civic duty, a systematic engine of survival. For a brief, shining moment in the early 1940s, Charles Drew was the undisputed guardian of the Allied pulse. He had built a bridge of life across the ocean, proving that science, when guided by brilliance and compassion, could outmaneuver even the Grim Reaper. He was the hero the world desperately needed, even if the world wasn't quite ready to truly see him.
The tragedy of Charles Drew's story is not that his genius went unrecognized, but that it was recognized and then deliberately suffocated by the very hands he sought to help. Following the spectacular success of the Blood for Britain campaign, the United States was preparing for its own inevitable entry into the conflict. The military high command, witnessing the miracle Drew had performed for the British, tapped him to lead the pilot program for the American Red Cross Blood Bank. It was the natural choice. He was, without question, the world's leading authority on blood preservation. He was the architect of the system they now desperately needed to scale up for American sons. But as he stepped into this role, ready to build a national lifeline, a dark and archaic order descended from the highest levels of the military establishment. The directive was cold, precise, and scientifically illiterate. The armed forces initially ruled that the blood of African Americans would not be accepted at all. Later, bowing slightly to pressure but retaining the core of their prejudice, they revised the policy. Black blood would be accepted, but it had to be strictly segregated from white blood. It was a policy born of fear, rooted in the Jim Crow laws that strangled the nation, and maintained to appease the sensibilities of a segregated society. To Charles Drew, this was not just an insult, it was a violation of the fundamental truths of science. He stood in the laboratories where he had peered through microscopes for years, looking at a reality that the generals refused to see. He knew, with the absolute certainty of a man of science, that blood plasma was biologically identical regardless of the race of the donor. There was no black plasma or white plasma. There was only human plasma. Drew was horrified. He found himself in a Kafkaesque nightmare where his expertise was revered enough to build the bank, but his humanity was despised enough to be excluded from it. He did not remain silent. In letters, in meetings, and in public statements, he dismantled the military's logic. He presented data. He argued that the segregation of blood was not just unnecessary, it was dangerous. It created logistical bottlenecks, wasted precious resources, and validated a lie that dehumanized millions of Americans. He famously stated, "The blood of individual human beings may differ by blood groupings, but there is absolutely no scientific basis to indicate any difference in human blood from race to race." It was a plea for rationality in an irrational world. Yet the walls of prejudice were thicker than the glass of his test tubes. The military brass, the politicians, and even the Red Cross leadership bowed to the superstition that mixing blood would somehow mongrelize the race. They told the man who had figured out how to save their lives that his science didn't matter as much as their bigotry. They were willing to complicate the logistics of survival, risking the lives of soldiers who might need a transfusion on the battlefield, simply to maintain a social hierarchy that had no place in medicine. It was a profound betrayal. The very expert trusted to engineer the salvation of the free world was being told that the fluid running through his own veins was a contaminant. This was the unscientific stain on the legacy of the greatest generation, a moment where the fear of equality overrode the fear of death itself.
There comes a moment in the life of every great individual when the cost of compromise becomes too high, when the silence required to keep a position of power becomes a weight too heavy to bear. For Dr. Charles Drew, that moment arrived in the early months of 1942. He stood at the pinnacle of his profession, the director of a program that was vital to the war effort, a man whose name commanded respect in medical circles around the globe. But he was also a black man in America, watching the institution he helped build perpetuate a lie that struck at the very core of his dignity. The segregation of blood was not merely a policy dispute, it was a moral abyss. How could he, the architect of this life-saving network, continue to oversee a system that labeled his own people as untouchable? How could he lend his name to a scientific falsehood?